On today's show, I'm honored to have Daniel McAdams. Daniel is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He's also the co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report, and I'm sure many of the people listening right now are very familiar with it. It's one of the most reliable and best YouTube channels in the world, and it's something that I really depend on to get my analysis out there. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the show.
Henry, thanks so much for having me with you. I'm really happy to join you.
The pleasure is all mine. And I'm really happy that you're able to join today because, like I was telling you before the show, I concentrate mainly on the Middle East. That's where I really have that's where I have my gaze on. And whenever something happens in Venezuela, it takes me time to really go through and flip through the crap to find the truth. And when I actually saw that there was a coup taking place, the first thing I thought was that the colonels conspired against Maduro, that there was, the CIA got to the military, and I thought there was an actual coup. In reality, that's not really what the case was. And I was hoping that you could, bring a little bit more context into what actually happened with this so-called coup.
Well, it's interesting. And there still is some speculation on exactly what happened. But I think from a few different pieces that I've read and that are out there now, and this includes even the Washington Post and the Atlantic had a piece today, I think. But primarily the thought entered my mind when I read a piece on the Moon of Alabama website. But in some way, I think this was kind of a counter operation, a counter coup operation launched by Maduro and maybe with the Russians' help. And it sounds a little bit crazy and conspiratorial, but if you hear it out, if you haven't read the article yet, it's pretty clear from the John Bolton video that he made at the end of the coup day, where he was crestfallen and he said, "Hey guys," he named off the names, the head of the defense minister in Venezuela, a couple of generals. "Hey guys, you said you were with us. What happened?" Little tear in his eye, and so it appears it's pretty obvious now that there was some negotiations, I think, between them, and the whole thing may have just been a ruse. And that's what Moon of Alabama is surmising. I think there's maybe something to it. Okay, here comes a representative of the U.S. government and Juan Guaido to these guys. They're approaching them saying, "Hey guys, this is what's going to happen. Here's what we have to offer." The military officers say, "Okay, we're with you. We're going to at the exact opportune moment, we're going to switch over to your side." And then meanwhile, they go back to Maduro and say, "You're never going to guess what's going on, and just go with it, and flip the switch, flip the script on the day." And I'm not trying to make light of it, but it almost appears as if this happened because Guaido came out there. He did his early morning dawn dramatic video. This is the beginning of the end of Maduro's usurpation of the presidency. All levels of the military are with me. This is going to be over quickly. And then it was like a big fizzle. It was like lighting a bad firecracker. Nothing happened. Yeah, there was a little bit of violence and a couple of skirmishes, but nothing dramatic whatsoever. And so it may have been really kind of the joke on Guaido, the joke on Bolton, the joke on Pompeo. But really, and I don't think he was in on it, but I think the real joke is on Trump, who fell for all of this ridiculous neocon nonsense.
Do you think Trump really trusted Bolton and his advisors when they said that they could actually make regime change happen?
I have a hard time gauging what Trump trusts, doesn't trust. Is he capable of trust? Is he a guy a fish so far out of water that is totally hopeless? And some people that have been close to him have suggested that to me too, that he's so over his head on a lot of this stuff. But there are things that he's good at. And I think he is quite good at them. I mean, I don't think anyone works a rally like he does. I wasn't a Trump supporter, but I enjoyed watching his rallies. They were tremendous. There are things he does really well. I don't think focusing on something of real importance like this is one of those things. And I think there are some things that indicate that. He canceled his daily intel briefings, which is pretty unusual for a president. And you might say, okay, I don't want the CIA bothering me every morning, telling me all this stuff, all this bad news. But the problem is then he said, I'll just have Bolton do it instead. And that's okay. That's the lazy guy's way out. But Bolton is thinking he's lucky stars because he gets to filter all the news. And that, aside from Fox News, will be about the only thing that Trump sees. So it's dangerous, I think, in a way, for him to limit his information to the filter of Bolton. because Bolton and the neocons, as we know, filtered all the information into the Iraq War in 2003, and it was all a bunch of lies. So, sorry, it's a long way of answering your question, but is he capable of understanding or trusting Bolton? I don't even think it goes that far.
Yeah, it's like he put the worst. He's trusting the worst possible guy on the job. It's something I actually saw, and I just read this, that Pompeo went ahead and he was claiming that Guaido was duly elected, and meanwhile the media they parroted everything that he said, like that he was duly elected, and that's not exactly the case, right?
That's not the case at all, and it really is a sad. I mean, I lived through the 2002, 2001 to 2003 lead up to the Iraq War. I was working for Dr. Paul on the Hill, and obviously he was opposed from the very beginning. We knew that it was all lies, but the preponderance of the media was so strongly in favor of it and unquestioning, and they all got slapped in the face. They were all totally wrong. They should have learned their lesson. That don't just be a conveyor belt of regime lies. And they didn't. And I think it's actually worse now with Venezuela, because there were a few voices back in 2002 questioning it, but now, as you say, there's just nothing. And so when Pompeo says something as preposterous as that, it doesn't matter what you think about Maduro, Guaido, socialism, electoral politics. There is a thing called facts. And he was not duly elected. He wasn't elected to anything. He was elected in 2015 to the National Assembly, and he was a relatively unknown backbencher. The leader of the opposition was Leopoldo Lopez. It was the first thing that happened when this coup started, is they broke him out of jail, which doesn't show a lot of confidence in Guaido. And then the first thing Lopez did is go off to the Spanish embassy and hide out there. But no, he was elected to parliament, but never to the presidency. He didn't even run for the presidency. So it's just another one of the many lies that they're trotting out at a fever pace.
And you would think that the way that the media is portraying him, and the way that, so many, guys like Marco Rubio and John Bolton and, the typical war hawkish guys in the Republican Party, and not just the Republican Party, but the typical culprits, they act like he is really popular. I mean, does he have any sort of following? Does he have any type of support within Venezuela?
Well, there was a poll taken in January when he declared himself president after a late night phone call from Mike Pence. Maybe he saw the Lord or something, I don't know. But he declared himself president right after his talk with Pence. And there was a poll that showed that I think only 1 of 4 Venezuelans had even ever heard of him. So he was an unknown figure. He didn't have any support because he was a backbencher. He was not a leading figure in the opposition. So he comes from from pure obscurity to somehow this great champion of democracy, even though he is unelected.
Do you think that the CIA, they just identified him as some sort of asset?
Well, there was a great piece by Max Blumenthal a couple of months ago, who really went and did a lot of the legwork, and this is the Greystone Project. He went back and checked, and really there have been State Department, which you could substitute USAID/CIA, projects going back 10, 15 or more years, that Guaido, that Lopez, and that others in the opposition had taken part in. And this happened a lot in Eastern Europe. It's happened a lot. The Arab Spring, you're probably more familiar than I with that. But the Arab Spring, there was a lot of training of young politicians, and it's basically it's training the cadres to do the bidding of the United States when they finally get in power. And the opposition of Venezuela were all taking part in this. They were all rewarded for this. And their ties to the U.S. government go back years and years and years.
And what I'm kind of worried about right now, and I'm actually surprised this didn't happen. Like, I always get scared that there's like going to be some type of sniper fire or something like that to create more violence and to create more panic. And then so that the U.S. or just any other human rights organization can go ahead and condemn the government, and the U.S. can make a better case for sanctions or even military intervention. I mean, were you surprised that didn't happen, or do you expect anything like to happen like that in the future now that
Yeah.
this coup has not really been anything.
Yeah, I think if someone wrote the book on these coups, the great title would be there are always snipers or something. There must be snipers, because it is the case. And actually, in 2002 in Venezuela, when they managed, and the U.S. government bragged about it when Chavez was briefly overthrown. They said we did it. This was George Friedman of the International Republican Institute, which is a U.S. government funded entity. He bragged and said, "We did it. We got rid of him." But there were snipers there. There were snipers at the Maidan in Ukraine. There were snipers. I mean, you name it. In every one of these coups, there are always snipers. A little surprised maybe that there weren't any this time. Maybe they tried to mix it up because there was this issue of the armed personnel carrier that rammed into some people. And I think they were trying to build that up as the casus belli. But I don't know if you noticed, but some people on Twitter posted the full chronology of the events, and it looks very much like it was the opposition who hijacked these APCs, because you could clearly see they had the blue armbands, unless they were the government pretending to be the opposition, pretending to be the government, which is always the possibility. But whatever the case, it looked like it was staged to kind of serve as the casus belli. Not as dramatic as snipers. Maybe they're saving that for the next time.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I remember when Maduro, apparently he burnt humanitarian aid. He set humanitarian aid on fire, and I heard multiple sources, so I'm kind of confused on this. But from what I saw, it looked like it was someone from the opposition who threw a Molotov cocktail at the aide, and it almost looked like he did it by mistake. It just kind of threw out of his hand, and they kind of just spin that story for at least a week that he intentionally burnt that. So I wasn't surprised to hear or see that clip of that armored vehicle going and, ramming into a bunch of people was played over and over and over and over again. But you would think that all these major networks would have more than just one camera. Like what's going on in the rest of Venezuela?
Direct feed from Langley. But even if it was, as they say, as unpleasant as it is, let's be honest, to do that, these guys were combatants in a military coup. They were throwing Molotov cocktails at military vehicles, and they ended up getting hit by those vehicles. I would just challenge anyone to go to downtown Washington in the middle of a coup, a military coup against the U.S. government, and start throwing Molotov cocktails at a U.S. military vehicle. I mean, those are the things that happen in war, and I would put forth that far worse things have happened in Paris, and no one is even bothering to talk about it at all. How many stories have we seen with people with their eyes shot out, shot through the head, journalists shot and roughed up? The media is totally uninterested in it. So it just goes to show the hypocrisy of what passes for a free press in the United States.
So now that Guaido, I mean, he's kind of proven himself to be a loser. Do you think that that the CIA will lose interest in him, or the State Department will lose interest in him? And do you think that he could be in danger?
Yeah, that's what I said on the Liberty Report on Tuesday. I think it was that the danger for Guaido is he's worth more dead than alive right now. And Lou Rockwell called me yesterday and said, "You may have saved his life by saying that," because maybe they called off the bad guys to whack him. But it's certainly true. I would hate to be Guaido, because you don't have a friend in the world. You've got Bolton, just pissed off at you. You've got Pompeo. You've got your own guys mad at you, and plus you're the laughing stock of Venezuela. You're out there like a big tough guy. Hey, this is all going to go down. Everyone's going to follow me. He looks around. There's a handful of people, and in particularly if you get outside of Eastern Caracas, which is the wealthy neighborhood, there's no one supporting him. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, he was going to go lead the people, as Bolton claims that he does, and he went to a neighborhood that wasn't pro-opposition, and the military of Venezuela had to protect him and get him back in his car as he squealed out of there, because he's not supported, certainly in the poorer parts of town.
So there apparently there's been reports about Maduro, he was about to flee. But that now, but and I'm really confused on this. But there's reports that the Russians told him to stay. That they like you can stay in the country. We have your back. I mean, can you add a little bit more context into what actually went on over there?
Well, that's what Pompeo claimed that night. This is the same Pompeo who a week and a half ago at Texas A&M said, "We lie, we cheat, and we steal. That's what we do for a living." So his credibility is not great, and the idea sounds pretty preposterous to me because he also claimed that the only reason that they didn't that the other people they had signed on to defect didn't defect is because there's 20,000 Cuban soldiers in Venezuela, and that seems pretty high because there are only 90,000 soldiers in the entire Cuban army, so they have 30% of their entire military parked in Venezuela. Seems a little bit stretchy to me, but I mean, I, I I'm a little depressed that the media is not more skeptical on what Pompeo was trying to say. And even President Trump actually, in his own President Trumpy way, I think backed away from what Pompeo said a little bit when he made some comments last night.
Well, Trump seems kind of hesitant now. Like he wasn't. He seems a lot less gung ho about a regime change in Venezuela. And I'm wondering if you think it has anything to do with just the overall failure of the operation.
Well, you can imagine putting yourself in his place. First of all, you've got to spend your entire day with neocons constantly bothering you, cajoling you, telling you, hey, this is going to be a cakewalk. Let's do this. Let's do this. We got to hit Iran. We got to hit Venezuela. We got to hit North Korea. I mean, talk about how annoying it must be to have these guys. But if it was me and I was in Trump's shoes, I would be furious because he looks like a fool. He looks idiotic for believing these guys, the gang who could never shoot straight. And here he is believing them, giving them credibility, letting them go along with their games, and it all blows up in his face. The only thing that's keeping him from being politically wounded, and we talked about this a little bit off camera, Henry, the only thing that's keeping him from being severely wounded is that his opposition, the Democratic Party, is all on board with this regime change. So, except for Tulsi Gabbard, who's the only one who's come out. What a juicy, ripe, low-hanging fruit for political opposition to do, to grab onto this and say, look how reckless this man is. He promised us one thing, no more regime change wars. And look what a hash he's made of this whole thing. He's clearly not fit to be in office. It just writes itself. But that doesn't happen because we really don't live in a system where there's real diversity of thought when it comes to really these life and death, war and peace issues.
And what I find really interesting is that there's even a split within the libertarian community. Before that we started recording this show, I tweeted out something about Venezuela, and libertarians responded to me, and they were like, "Listen, like I'm normally against regime change, but in this case, I'm concerned about the two cases that they usually bring up are number one, obviously the evil communist empire will somehow spread out of Venezuela into other countries, and just repeating McCarthy talking points, or they'll just talk about the geopolitical interest of China and Russia. And I'm wondering if you knew any more, like if you knew about or know why Russia and China are interested in what exactly that relationship details.
Well, this is something that Dr. Paul often talks about on the Liberty Report. This is how off track we are as a country. China and Russia are down there investing. They're investing in the infrastructure. They're investing in oil. They've spent billions of dollars in Venezuela, which is a potentially rich country, and they're interested in making a buck. They're interested in being capitalists. And here we are. We're interested in building our empire and reverting to this idiotic Monroe Doctrine that is completely misquoted and misunderstood in the first place. So we're going down there pushing people around, telling them who their president is, who it isn't. And these horrible Chinese commies are down there doing business. How dare they? It's like the world has been turned upside down. It's completely nuts. And, this whole libertarian thing, I mean, I don't get it. So many of them are furious with me because they have this bizarre idea that somehow I'm pro-commie because I not only do I refuse to endorse a U.S. military intervention, I refuse to repeat the regime change talking points. And that's what they don't want. They want me to say, they want people like us to say, oh, it's worse than ever. People are eating their pet hamsters. They're dying in the streets, but we shouldn't intervene. No, if you go down that road, you're repeating the regime change talking points. You are doing the heavy lifting. And Caitlin Johnstone, who's not a libertarian, but who's very good on non-interventionism, she wrote a terrific piece a few weeks ago on this whole thing. No, you are repeating, you are a conveyor belt for CIA regime change propaganda. Whether or not you support regime change or not, it doesn't matter. So I'm just not going to play the game. Lou Rockwell has always told me, never let them force you to use the language of the neocons, the regime change language when they want you to. And I think it's just absolutely key.
My friend Jose Nino, who's a real Venezuelan expert, he writes for Mises. He says he's from Venezuela. He was I think he came to the States when he was around 7 or so, and he is very aware of the economic. He writes about that almost not exclusively, he has a lot of other things, but he writes a lot about the economic problems in Venezuela, and he condemns a lot of their economic practices, obviously. However, the case that he makes for not going on some type of imperial escapade over there is that if you think the migrant crisis is bad now, then wait till Venezuela erupts into civil war.
Yeah, I mean, there's a case for that. That's a possibility, certainly, no doubt. But the thing that if everyone is so concerned with the well-being of Venezuelans, why not just put some pressure on our government to end the sanctions? There were sanctions all along, and it did cause problems. And they don't have a perfect economic system. I don't think we have a right to throw the first stone when it comes to that matter. Anyway, but it wasn't until 2017 that the sanctions were ratcheted up to the level where they really caused pain. And they're designed to cause pain. They're designed to cause people to die. We know this from Madeleine Albright. We know this from just how sanctions work. They hurt the people who are the most vulnerable in society. So if these so-called libertarians were really concerned about the situation of Venezuelans, why not pressure your own government to get rid of the sanctions? Let's go down there and do, oh, you're pro-business? That's great. You're pro-free market? That's great. Let's saturate the place with free market, with business ventures, with getting involved in that way. And then socialism, if it's as weak as they claim, which I agree, it will collapse under its own weight, as it did in Eastern Europe. It's like these people that believe we have to blow up the Middle East so that God can come down and have the second coming. He doesn't need our help if that's what he wants to do. And the same is true with socialism. It doesn't need our help to collapse. It will collapse. The best thing to do is for us is do what the Chinese and Russians are doing. Do business there, So whatever.
And I think a lot of them don't understand that. I did a podcast on this the other day about sanctions, and a lot of people don't understand that the sanctions, they alienate the U.S. from people who would be natural reformers within the country, because no one's ever going to choose a foreign power over their brother, their family, their neighbors, because, like you said, economic sanctions, I feel that they end up just empowering the regime because the people go to the regime for the solution. And I want to ask you, do you think, like, after all of this, do you think Maduro has even more support now?
Yeah, it probably does. I mean, that's natural. But the other thing that people should understand is that it might just be the case that the Venezuelans want to have a socialist system. So how is it our job to impose something else on them that they want? What if they want that? Okay, whatever. I mean, what business is it of ours to tell them if 50% plus one want it? Maybe in 20 years, they'll start changing their minds, especially if they see us setting a good example instead of a bad example. So it actually is an act of aggression for us to presume that we should be able to impose an economic system on them when they may not be ready for it. Change should be evolutionary, not revolutionary. Revolutions very, very rarely, I think Dr. Paul said, there's only been one revolution in history that's the end result is better than when it started, and that was the American Revolution. So there's a lot of faulty thinking that goes into this, and there are a lot of faulty assumptions. We had Nassim Nicholas Taleb speak at our conference last year, who I consider one of the most brilliant philosophers, one of the greatest libertarians, a legendary investor. And he made a great point. It'd be very possible, and I'm going to misquote him, but you'll get the essence of it. It's very possible to have anarchism at a local level and communism at a village level. And that certainly would be fine and would be completely okay within the libertarian principle if it's all voluntary. So there's this kind of libertarian Trotskyism that presumes that we have a duty of going overseas and telling everyone else how to live. And I'm sorry, that violates the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, and I think they're missing a point that that Hugo Chavez didn't bring these economic systems that they have in place right now. Like they had a socialist light system for a long time, at least is from what I've known. They've had a socialist like system, or at least social democrats in charge for decades. And like, what would be the outcome? Like, what would regime change create? Like, because like I always went under the assumption that politics or policy always comes down from the culture. And if the Venezuelan people want a socialist country, then like, aren't they, if they have fair and democratic elections, aren't they just going to continue to put in social democrats or socialist politicians?
Yeah, and if that's what they want, then who are we to tell them they can't? They're not going to, put on their suits and turn into German bankers tomorrow. There is culture. There is such a thing as culture in history, and that certainly is a fact. But the other thing about the word socialism has become sort of a weaponized word. It's a bogeyman that they use. I was looking around at some different indicators of relative socialism, and when you look at Venezuela on the scale of other countries, it's around there with France and Finland and Germany's a little better, but Italy, it's all in that neighborhood. It's not like 1950 in Kiev or something. So it's a word that has been used, I think, as a dog whistle for libertarians to get them on board for regime change. And it's dangerous to think that way. And if you look at how the Venezuelans, okay, the natural resource of oil has been nationalized and it's used to compensate the people. Foodstuffs, I guess they get a basic food package and medical and all this stuff. Well, we have a similar system in Alaska, where every Alaskan resident gets a check, I think, for $1,000 a month or something like this. I don't know, 1,000 a year, whatever it is, but it's part of their share of the oil revenue. So it's not that awfully different from what we do. It's different in scale and degree or what have you, but it's not like something that landed off the face of Mars or something.
Yeah, they just act like there's so many people that act like Venezuela is just so unique and so in there. It's like the second coming of the communist empire, and I'm just really perplexed by that narrative, because they don't really seem that different from other countries, from other just modern Western countries. Their living standards, yeah, are way below, but
Yeah, I
like,
mean, I don't want to argue for socialism, and
yeah.
my detractors are going to be angry, but the fact is, those living in the worst poverty before Chavez and after Chavez, their lives did improve, and that's objectively true. That doesn't mean I think it's the best system. Obviously, it's not, for a number of reasons that anyone who studies Austrian economics would understand. But it is a fact that it did help improve abysmally poor fourth world level standard of living to be a third world. I don't think there would be much more to offer after that, but it did do some good in the interim there. But again, the word has been weaponized, and everyone is so many people, somehow thinking that I'm, supporting the concept of socialism. I don't want it to be used as a tool to mobilize support for regime change.
Well, I find it pretty hard to fathom to someone to weaponize the word socialism against you when you're the co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report,
Well,
which is
that makes it even juicier for them to accuse me of that. And it's weird, and I'm kind of suspicious, but maybe I torture myself by looking at Twitter too much. But all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, there are all these strange accounts. You don't know what it's like. I'm here in Venezuela, and I wonder, really? I mean, I know that the CIA is pretty good at putting together a lot of these sock puppet accounts, and I'm pretty suspicious about a lot of this stuff.
you think that there's a lot of bot accounts that have been created by the U.S.?
I, I would think they'd be amiss if they weren't doing something like this. And we know for a fact that they do this. The military does this. The CIA does this. It's part of a full spectrum warfare. And I think it's an important part.
So another thing that, like, another common talking point that comes out and this is coming from the anti-interventionists, is that the U.S., the only reason why they want to, the anti-interventionists, the non-interventionists, they're saying that the U.S., their main strategic interest in Venezuela is just, frankly, their oil as well as their mineral wealth. I mean, do you think that's the case, or do you think it's the case of just trying to boot Russia and China out?
I think it's probably some kind of a combination. I think, from what I understand, and I'm far from an expert, from what I understand, Venezuelan oil has to have a very special kind of refining process, and it's actually a bit more expensive. Ironically, all of this mischief is raising the price of oil. It's probably going to give them more money in the end. But I think they want the oil. But I think, especially some on the left, I think are a little bit too simplistic in thinking we just want to grab that oil. I think it is about denying access to Russia and China. And we've seen that throughout Africa. There's a race for resources there. You think about some place like Sudan. The Chinese were the first in there investing in their oil infrastructure. This is several years ago now. And in the U.S., what did we have? We had this kind of a fake, fake news or fake concern about Darfur. We've got to save the Sudanese. And so they ended up breaking the country in half. And it was a great victory for American human rights neocons and neoliberals and humanitarian interventionists. And now the situation is 1,000 times worse in South Sudan than it was before. But back to the point, the Chinese were down there, and there's a lot of oil down there, and they were getting involved in that. And I think this is what the U.S. spooks did to wrong foot them in Africa. And there really is a battle going on in Africa right now for resources. We don't want anyone else to have it.
And that kind of segues me into something else. So I know that on the Ron Paul Liberty Report, you were talking about the Strait of Hormuz. So I want to kind of segue over into Iran a little bit. We talk a lot about Iran, about how the sanctions are, I think they're going to be doing a lot more harm than good in the long run. And now Iran's talking about shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. I guess, could you provide just general context of what the Strait of Hormuz is, why it's important, and what do you think the consequence would be if Iran took measures to shut it down?
Yeah, it is a good question, and we did cover that on today's show. But it's a narrow strait. To pass through, I think the northern and eastern segment. I mean, I may be wrong, but you do go through Iranian territorial waters according to the laws of the Sea Treaty, the 1982 law of the Sea Treaty. So there is a situation where when the U.S. tries to go through there, they literally have to communicate with the Iranians to let them know they're going through. So that's how narrow it is. And 20 to 25% of the world's oil and refined petroleum products goes through there on any given day. So if that were to shut down, everyone that studies it says it would have enormous implications for the world economy. Even a brief shutdown would have huge implications. And we talked a lot about Scott Ritter's piece in the American Conservative today or yesterday about this, and Scott did a great job of just breaking the whole thing down. But he points out that the private oil tankers are going to have a hell of a time getting insurance if there's some skirmishes around that area. And so that may even if it's a very brief shutdown, it may have the mid to long term effect of really messing up the economy. So it's a very delicate situation. The Iranians have threatened to close it if we start mucking around in there, and we've threatened to prevent them from exiting their ports with ships filled with oil. So the question is, how far are either side? That's why I think we called it red line in talks of war. How far is either side willing to go on this? I think it's an incredibly dangerous situation. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that right now we're closer to war with Iran than we have been in a really long time. And it's pretty scary because what I always try to tell my listeners, and the message I always try to put out, is like, if we've ever got involved in a military conflict in Iran, it would be so much worse. It would just be hell on earth. And I try to point out that it wouldn't just be like Middle East instability. If you think it's bad now, wait till there's a war in Iran, because it's not just going to be a war in Iran. It's going to be a war in Iraq. I'm sure Hezbollah will get involved in it. It will be a Middle Eastern, total Middle Eastern conflict. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. So I always try to put that message out that it would just be terrible. And there's been war simulations where we've lost thousands of soldiers in
Mm.
mock invasion. So I just I cannot see any type of military solution to Iran besides going completely insane and dropping a nuclear bomb, which is nuts. And I don't want to give them ideas, but
Yeah.
uh, it's just craziness to me that that's even a suggestion, and the fact that we're getting closer to that is it just shows the irresponsibility of the guys who have these high positions like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who self-admittedly lies, cheats, and steals.
Yeah, and also, you get into some weird theology issues as well, and you've heard Pompeo talk about how God sent Trump to bring on the second coming or something weird like this. This is pretty scary. I mean, I'm all for people having religious views. I have strong views of my own, but in a situation like that, you have to wonder: is there a line that you're crossing where you're no longer serving your government, but you're serving your own sectarian belief system? And I think that is quite dangerous. I think that's why they're dealing so much with Iran in the Middle East. But the foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Zarif, said that he's worried about a false flag, and that sounds like something that the that the war hawks would be able to cook up over there, and that's something like that that's fairly spectacular. And you're going to have a lot of people, a lot of people signing on. Certainly, the media will be hook, line, and sinker for war. The libertarians will probably come to your house and my house and beat us up, and for not being with the program. So it's going to get ugly if there's some kind of really nasty false flag.
What I find really interesting about Iran is that I feel like if they would do something there, they wouldn't do it a direct military intervention. I feel like they would try to set some type of ethnic divide between Arab populations there and Persian populations, or something like they did in Syria, where they would cause some type of internal strife. Um, because it certainly seems that they're really pointing all fingers on them. They even Mike Pompeo even blamed Yemen on Iran. He was
Yeah,
blaming the humanitarian crisis in Yemen on Iran, and that's in that the same speech where he announced the waivers. So
yeah,
it was unbelievable. I found that really, really just quite gross when he put the blame on Iran, and he didn't give any culpability to the Saudis and
yeah.
to
We
us.
lie, we cheat, we steal. He lied, as usual. I mean, the Saudis, it was a war of aggression, and it still is a war of aggression. There's no question about it. And if even if the Houthis were seeking aid from the Iranians, what's wrong with that? We seek aid from our allies. What's how is it okay if we do these things and nobody else is allowed to in the rest of the world? They're the victims of Saudi aggression, yet they're not allowed to look around for allies to help them out. That's what they blame Assad. Oh, yeah, you got the Russians and the Iranians to come help you. Well, you're damn right I did. I was about to get taken over by a bunch of lunatic head choppers. Of course I did. As if there's something wrong with that. It's just that's a bizarre way of looking at the world.
It really is. It's something I found an interesting take is that one of the big reasons, and this ties into Strait of Hormuz for the war in Yemen, is because Saudi Arabia wants to get port access on the south of Yemen to circumvent the Strait of Hormuz in the case that that would shut down. I was wondering if you thought that that's something that I've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. And I guess I'm looking for maybe a little reassurance that that take is at least has some type of validity, so I can so I'm putting my audience in the right direction.
Yeah, I've definitely read that myself in a number of occasions. So I think that is the case. And I think another factor in the whole thing is Israel. And I have to believe that the Israelis, maybe Netanyahu and a few radicals on this aside, this is going to be a hellstorm because everyone is ticked off at the Israelis. They bombed Syria about 200 times. Everyone is just chomping at the bit. If this thing blows, Israel is gonna be in a world of pain too. Of course, they have the ability. They've got the military ability to smash everyone to shreds. But I think in the interim, they're gonna be in pretty bad shape too. So I can't imagine the Israelis are too enthused about a big war breaking out with the U.S. and Iran. I just don't believe it.
You don't think that they would support a war with the U.S. and Iran?
I just can't imagine them looking forward to something like that. I think they could, of course, they could, they could take on anyone. They've got nukes. They could blow the whole place apart. But they're going to have a hell of a firestorm in the process. Who wants that? I don't think they want that. I'm sure that just like we've got our crazies, I'm sure there were some crazies over there who might want it. But I think if you stopped an Israeli on the street, I can't imagine they'd be enthusiastic about a war with Iran.
It certainly doesn't seem like it would be in their interest. I doubt that there are many Israelis who are at home rattling the sabers, you
Yeah,
know, wanting to wage war in Iran because how bad it would be, and it would also, I think, it would also provoke, more conflict with Hezbollah right there on their doorstep. So
exactly.
I feel like it would definitely not be in their interest.
They're chomping at the bit. And plus, don't forget, Iran has the second largest Jewish community in the Middle East after Israel. So there's going to be a lot of targeting. My guess is, maybe I'm wrong, but certainly there'll be some scapegoating of Iranian Jews if that were to happen, and that would be horrible too.
It's something that's interesting. I spoke to Mohammed Sahimi, who he's a professor at USC, and he writes for Low Blog. He writes for antiwar.com sometimes, and he wrote this really telling article called "Iranians Fake and True Opposition," and he went down the list of different Iranian lobby groups in the U.S. that are, ex-monarchist and loyal to the Shah and things like
Mm.
that, who are really championing regime change, and they're seen by the Iranian public, the general Iranian public. They're looked at as complete traitors. Even the people who are progressive and who want internal change, they look at them and it's like, wow, this guy is trying to lobby for policies that actually are going to hurt just the individual person. So
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting take.
It's kind of like when we were talking about Venezuela a little while ago. If the Iranians want to live with the kind of sort of theocratic system they have, it's not my cup of tea, but it doesn't bother me. I'm not, no one's forcing me to live there, and if you don't like living there, if we would treat them normally, the people who don't like living there should be able to go somewhere else and live and work. It's just this weird kind of messianic thing. I think Americans are really, it's like some kind of virus that's taking over, that we've become this messianic force that feels the need, this obligation to change the world and make it exactly like we are. I just don't get it. It seems crazy to me.
Yeah, and they use those two. They had the two vague notions, on in the Middle East. It's the vague notion of radical Islam. It's always a fight against radical Islam because it's vague enough where it can be anything, and
Hmm.
then it's scary enough sounding that it could it sounds like it can't be reasoned with. Um, and then socialism, and that's the other vague term that's used as a pretext. It could be anyone with an economic policy that you don't like. But I mean, yeah, you or I wouldn't want to live in one of those countries, or abide by those systems of government. But if the public wants it,
Yeah.
why force it down their throat to change?
Yeah, I like to have occasional beer. I don't know if they have beer in Iran, but I wouldn't want to live in Saudi Arabia. I don't think you can get it there. But it's that's when I was working on Dr. Paul's congressional staff, that his chief of staff at the time was a fellow named Tom, a really smart guy, and I would draft some complicated statement on something or other, and he would say, Daniel, you have to be able to explain it in a bumper sticker, you know, and I think that's a good point. And I think unfortunately the people who are opposed to our view, that the authoritarians, they're pretty good at bumper stickers, and that's it. Radical jihad, radical Islam, socialism, and it's these are emotional words, and they're very effective at mobilizing people, catalyzing support with those kinds of things.
Yeah, I completely agree. They really weaponize those bumper sticker slogans. I mean, is there anything else? I know that we're running, and I know you mentioned about you'd had around 30 minutes. We're running close to 50 minutes, so I really do
Wow.
appreciate all the insight. Like, I'll let you go after this one last question. So, what do you think is I guess the probability that the U.S. engages in some type of military intervention? Um, in either Venezuela or in either Iran, just because they seem to be on the eye of Sauron is almost is really gazing on them right now.
I think it's better than 50-50. To be honest, I hate to say that. But I think if Trump falls for this, he's going to be surprised. All of his friends in the Washington Post who hated him up until the second before he pushed the button, they're all going to turn on him. He'll be abandoned, and he'll be remembered as an absolute abject failure. And if someone could just convey that idea to him, he might think twice. But the gatekeepers there are all in favor of war. So I wish I could be more optimistic, Henry. I really do.
Yeah, me too. I'm still hoping for the best. I'm still hoping that there's some people in the foreign policy establishment who consider themselves at the very least foreign policy realist. I feel like that term's coming up more and more today. That I'm a foreign policy realist that know the harm and know the human toll of not just American soldiers, but just how much it would alienate us from the international community that know the consequences of these wars. So I'm kind of pulling for that
Yeah.
there's some voices of reason in there. It just seems that the guys who have the really high positions are the kookiest of the kookiest.
That's exactly. You got it. You got it.
Well, this is great. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me, and I know that you just got off a flight, so I can't really tell you how much this means to me, and it's absolutely thrilling to speak to you, especially since I just rely on you so much. I rely on your work so much. It's really awesome to speak to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really wish you the best, and I hope your show grows by leaps and bounds. I hope all of our shows grow by leaps and bounds.